This panel has two presentations which deal with the two different practices of non-territorial arrangement in the first decades of the 20th century, namely the Moravian Compromise in the Habsburg monarchy and national personal autonomy, especially Polish autonomy in Ukrainian People's Republic in revolutionary years. Each presentation has 20 minutes, and then I will provide comments and questions. So I introduce first presenter Andrea Pokludova, who lectures at the Department of History of University of Ostrava. Her research interests include the social and urban history of the Czech lands of the long 19th century, and she is currently conducting research on the Moravian Compromise with Pavel Gladiver, our visiting research fellow, who presented yesterday. So please, that presentation, floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies, gentlemen, they're all. In our research, we have been dealing with the issue of Czech-German interaction and confrontation in the Moravia society in the modernization process for a long time. Our interest in the topic of the Moravian Pact stem primarily from this research, which we had always dealt with using the comparative approaches of historical science. The research of the the research of the impact of the Moravian Pact we carried out for the 6 most populous municipalities in Moravia, with a linguistic minority at the least 10%. That is Brünn, Olmütz, Znaim, Iglau, Mährisch, Ostrau, and Vítkovice. In historical memory, these towns had become the symbol of the Czech-German conflict, coexistation in numerous spheres of everyday life. In this paper, I will focus your attention only on Olomouc. The choice of Olomouc results from the city-specific position within the examined set of the cities and from my previous research, which also allows me to interpret the issue in a broader context. After a brief introduction of the town Olomouc, the conflict zones of the Czech-German coexistence in economic, cultural, and political life will be outlined. Based on our knowledge of the fact regarding Olomouc, we asked observers questions to which we intend to provide answers. Did the Moravian Pact have an impact on the town society divided by the national activists? And if so, in which spheres of activity? To what extent was it implementable in education, which was, from the 17th, affected by the fight for the schools and children? Did the self-government implement Lex Parma? Did the reform of the election to the Land Diet have an impact of the local politics? Was there a national reconciliation in the town, or did the division of the population in the spheres of economic and cultural life deepen on the who-is-who basis? In the mid-19th century, Olomouc was a fortress town and the administrative center of the agrarian Hana. In the second half of the 19th century, the town became a regional center of the trade and services, education, Czech and German journalism, and cultural event. Olomouc was not, like smoke towns in Moravia, a locality with an ethnically homogeneous population. In the ethnic composition of the population in the second half of the 19th century and early 20th century can be outlined based on the records of the language of daily use, and even this was influenced in the time by the action of the Czech and German national activists. The census did not take into account the traditional bilingualism of the population in language mixed region to which Olomouc, as a German language enclave, belonged. Much of the town's population was actively or passively bilingual. In the census sheets, the inhabitants of Olomouc state numerous variants of the registration of the Deutsch Mährisch, Deutsch Bämisch, Bämisch Mährisch, Slawische Mährisch, the language of daily use. And now, I would like briefly outline the conflict coexistence of the Czech-German population, or rather, national activists in the era of nationalization of local society. At the level of the municipal politics, the era of cooperation between the representatives of the German and Czech ethnic groups came to an end in the 70s. That is, in the time when the circle of the Czech intelligentsia began to strive to establish a public school in the town and push through language equality in self-government. With the nationalization of the society in the 80s, the national activists began to create barriers between the two modern nationalities in the town. The town self-government was purposely creating the construct of the German Olomouc, Olmütz. A key tool to this was the municipal statute and electoral system. Using official authority, it obstructed the political, economic, and cultural demands of the emancipation Czech population. For the Czech activists, capturing this German bastion on the region had become one of the goals of their politics. To this end, they carried out intensive activities at the political level and in the economic sphere. The turn of the 20th century in the town and the surrounding area could already be characterized by periodically recurring and escalating Czech-German clashes in politics, economic, and culture. The press, whether German or Czech, stirred up an escalating of the conflict with not also always objective reporting. The German press, regardless of political direction, inspired an almost pathological fear in the readers about the growing influence of the Czech population in the town. On the other hand, the Czech journalists foresaw that the existing circumstances would change radically in the future years and called for the mobilization of forces. The escalation of the Czech-German relation in Olomouc is connected with the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the birth of František Falcký, very important Czech politic and historian, 1898 in Holice. When the Czech society was returning from Holice to Olomouc, it was attacked by German youth. The attack ended with the intervention of the police. Street fights between the Czech and German male inhabitants had become a relatively common phenomenon at the early 20th century, which could hardly have been prevented in the turbulent wave of nationalization. But what affected the microcosm of the small town society more deeply than clashes in the streets was economic nationalism, namely a mutual boycott of trade and services taken place under the slogan Svůj k svému, mine to mine, and Deutschen zu Deutschen in the mid of the 19th by Czech National Association. As the Czech customers began to fulfill their needs with a growing number of the Czech shops, the loss of the Czech buying power soon became apparent in the circles of the German business. And how did the boycott under the slogan "mine to mine" manifest itself in everyday life? Those who had from the point of view of the national activists, broken faith with the boycott, were harshly criticized on the pages of the local press. It was not only the private and professional lives of the men with power that took place under public control, but under the guise of nationalism, even the doing of the small men and women had become, in the terms of historical anthropology, the object of the public interest. In a language-mixed town, the era of education was battlefield on which sword fight took place about established public school on a national principle. The same was true in Olomouc. Czech schools were rejected as a symbol of the attack on the German characters of the town. The topic of the fight for children is now thanks to the work of Tara Zahra. In the case of Olomouc, each child could be tipped on the scales in favor of not only the establishment, but especially the development of the Czech Volksschule. That is the opening of parallel of higher classes. Coercive methods were used by both sides of so-called fight for the child. The pressure on the individuals to identify with either the Czech or German society in the town was enormous in numerous spheres of the everyday life. That is from economic activities, trade and services, to the population census and school enrollments, and at the end, to the politic, that is election. The topic of municipal and land politics in relation to Olomouc was the subject of one of our books, and it is briefly presented in the draft of this paper. At this point, let us recall that the German political representation of the city from the mid-70s considered the preservation of the German character of the city to the main pillars of politics. That is, it completely rejected Czech emancipation demands. The Czech political representation, with the rising generation of politicians educated at the Charles University in Prague, was more radical in its demand at the beginning of the 20th century, and less willing to make political compromises. We had concluded in our previous research that the gap between the local leaders of the Czech and German political scene was immense and difficult to overcome by political negotiation. And has anything changed in the city after the conclusion of the Moravian Pact? Shortly after the conclusion of the pact, the invitation of politicians stand to the election to the Land Diet, in which the voting took place according to the electoral system adopted by the Moravian Pact. The principle of the so-called national curie, that is separate electoral district for Czech and German voters, was introduced. National registers of voters, that is namely Czech and German, were created. In Olomouc, putting together in national registers created a conflict situation. The Czech daily Pozor published a critical commentary on their existence. According to the paper, there should have been about 2,070 voters in the Czech electoral register in Olomouc, but the numbers in the list did not correspond with that. This was responded by Maryše Stagbad, which claimed that the Czech activists had been collecting powers of attorney around the town for reclaiming from the German register. The following day, the newspapers were already writing about Czech terrorism in the town. The Czech activists threatened to economically boycott those who they believed to belong in the Czech register and who did not intend to reclaim themselves, And in the social practice of everyday life in Olomouc, this was a real threat. The revision of the National Register was undertaken by Dr. Richard Fischer as a leading national activist, and he had the list from the private population censuses and school enrollments, from which it was clear who was who. Who was a conscious Czech, and who was nationally ambivalent, who claimed allegiance to the German because of assimilation process, and who under the jurors and due to poverty. Following the election, the press body of German liberals, Mährisches Tagblatt, gave a positive assessment of the National Register. In its option, the new electoral system for the Land Diet ended the Czech pre-election fight with the Germans. This claim can be agreed with. The creation of the National Curie eliminated the conflict zones between the Olomouc Czech and Germans and the time of land election. But nothing has changed in municipal politics. And let us turn our attention to the conflict area of Olomouc education in relation to the implementation of Lex Perec. The local national activists had carried out the pivotal phase of the fight for children before 1905. Through activities related to the school enrollments, population censuses, economic boycott, association activities, and preparation for reclaiming to national register, they had mapped the local situation according to the who is who criterion. Another front in the struggle was the fight to construct a new school building of the Czech public school. The last era mentioned in relation to the Moravian Pact is the implementation of Lex Parma, which the Olomouc self-government approached laxly. In conclusion, let me mention one more sphere from the life of Olomouc society in which further division of the society on the principle who is who in relation to the nationality is perceptible. During the year 1906, the mayor of the city was interpelled by one of the representatives regarding the Czechization of the state and regional offices in the city. He submitted a list with the national composition of their officials. And sources document that there was a behind-the-scenes fight for every higher official post, the position of judge or doctor in hospital, whether a German or Czech would be appointed. Intervention of higher position and lobbying was used by both the self-government and the Czech national activists. The nationality of the candidate or their national stance on the eve of the Great War often played a more important role in appointment than their qualifications. The application of the package of the laws of the so-called Moravian Pact in each of the towns followed from the local conditions and nuances of interaction between two nationalities, or rather the action of the local politicians and national activists. In the case of Olomouc, was a town which, under their influence, was the center of National Union for Northeast Moravia and the Bund der Deutschen Nordmähren, and the everyday life that is local economy, education, association life, politics, was under their scrutiny. In my opinion, the division of the local economy into the Czech and German was contrary to the market economy. It limited its development. In many aspects, the liberal individual rights and freedoms were violated under the guise of collective rights, that is, acting in the name of the nation. Although the friction areas were eliminated after the pact on the level of holding land election, The fight continued in the era of municipal politics, education, and in the sphere of language equality. Ordinary people were drawn into the struggle of national activists, as evidenced by various records and sources, but which also testified to the fact that despite the division of the society of the principle who is who, some people enter internationally mixed marriages and raise their children in both languages, that is, Czech and German. And at the end, the change of political hegemony on the city hall in 1918 did not end the conflict coexistence in the interwar Olomouc society. Thank you.
So next presenter is Gennadii Korolov, who is director of Institute for Study of East Central Europe, Kiev, Ukraine, and who is currently conducting research at Institute for East and Southern European Studies in Regensburg. He has published many works on federalism and autonomy ideas in modern East Central Europe, with special focus on Ukraine. So please start presentation.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Yuki, for kind introduction. And so today I'm going to talk about more practice of non-territorial autonomy in East Central European history, but not about theory, which we have a lot here. So, I would like to start my talk with a quote. And in 1923, one of the former officials of the Ministry of Polish Affairs in Ukrainian People's Republic, member of the Polish Socialist Party, Kazimierz Domosłowski, wrote in his memories, "To win over Jews, they were offered Ukrainian Central Council something, as he meant, something never seen before, national personal autonomy. Poles in whole combination were the least needed. It also matters the least of Poles." In my opinion, this quote shows not just the Polish sentiment the Jews embraced ascendancy in this issue. This stance is more than symptomatic and demonstrates the widespread attitude of the Polish national movement towards the Ukrainian statehood in 1917-1920. Understanding the concept of extraterritorial autonomy and its implementation in the Ukrainian People's Republic and abolishment in Hetmanat Ukraine in July 1918 has remained an explored topic and has grown into many historiographic cliches. In contemporary historiography still exist some of them. First, the idea of national non-territorial autonomy testified to the democratic character of Ukrainian statehood in 1917-1920, but not a socialistic one. Second, it was a significant attempt to solve the national minority issue in East Central Europe. Third, this problem in many degrees does not explain the revolutionary process in Ukraine in 1917-1921. In contrast, the story of Polish national autonomy illustrates the vague empirical basis of this myth. The literature on this problem is sparse, and today exists only several works on the Polish national autonomy in Ukraine at that time. Despite the classic study of a left-wing Polish historian and influential politician of the Polish People's Republic, Henryk Jablonski, who published in 1930s a couple of articles and book in 1948. Firstly, he presented an outline of his research at the seminar of the Ukrainian Institute in Washington and was supported by Ukrainian emigre scholars, but had a chance to continue his work only after the Second World War. For obvious reasons, this topic had not been studied in Polish historiography at all periods. During the interwar and communist periods, talking about autonomy for Poles in Ukraine sounded ideologically strange and politically vague. My paper is mainly based on testimonies collected in 1943 by Henryk Jabłonski. He arranged interviews with the 15 activists of Polish national movement in Ukraine in 1917-1920, most of whom were officials at the Ministry of Polish Affairs. As Jabłonski pointed out, the national personal autonomy was just an experiment that did not change our regard to Ukraine. National autonomy in Ukraine was not to be considered as a constitutional program of proletariat, as Otto Bauer captured. It shows an experiment with democracies that did not have any connection to socialism. In many respects, Jabłonski archival materials and other sources deconstruct the idealistic vision of the national personal autonomy in revolutionary Ukraine. It also was to emphasize that, in my opinion, Jabłonski was not fully honest in his work, but retained some critical insights into national autonomy in his book. The story of national personal autonomy in Ukrainian context was not unambiguous. Before and during the First World War, leaders of the Ukrainian national movement, who were the protagonists of the territorial ethnographic model for the solution of national questions, sharply criticized the idea of non-territorial autonomy. Jabłonski points out that idea of national autonomy transferred to Ukrainian political parties from their Galician brothers. The same political attitude on territoriality and ethnographic elements was held by the Polish Socialist Party and Polish right-wing circles, whereas the Jewish political forces, particularly the Bund Party, promoted other stand on this issue. Revolutionary Ukraine in 1917-1918 aimed to be a democratic state. Its elites tried to implement progressive concepts for shaping the new political structure and the form of government as their leaders thought. They chose the republic as a political form because the empire was perceived as the main event in history. Before the 1917 revolution, Poles that inhabited in Ukrainian lands in the Russian Empire skeptically considered the Ukrainian national movement and the idea of Ukraine as an independent state. This attitude intensified after the Brest Treaty between Ukrainian People's Republic and the Central Powers in February 1918, when, despite a region like Homshchina were recognized as a part of Ukrainian state. However, before this, after the July Compromise in 1917 between the provisional government in Petrograd and the Ukrainian Central Council, some of Polish politician organizations actively involved in the making of the political and government structure of Ukraine. Polish Democrats regarded the decision of autonomy for national minority as a primary matter that could unite Ukrainians as Poles and was considered by them as a way of emancipation from Russian domination. In general, this process was instead a reaction to existing political circumstances, but not a sincere intention of the Polish national movement. This very initiative for making the autonomy structure was supported by the narrow environment of Kievan Poles, who called themselves Democrats. Some of them recalled this endeavor and described their role in this process. Another circle of the Polish national movement, the right-wing one, had not considered Ukrainian Central Council as a legal power. The story of this twist and turns on this issue looks as follows. In early June 1917 was formed the Polish Democratic Center, headed by famous Mason Stanisław Stempowski. It was a political organization with a vague ideological platform. The main slogan was to protect the Polish people's rights in Ukraine and fight for democracy. Initially, this organization was founded in opposition to the Polish Executive Committee in Rus, a right-wing Polish organization. Nevertheless, some nuances of the ideology of the center and the vision of the national minority issue presented it by its honorary chief Evgeniusz Starczewski in his book Toward Reconstruction. The reaction and feedback on this work show how ambiguous and label stance on the issue of national autonomy had widespread among Polish activists in Ukraine. In Starczewski's option, future Poland, like each other multi-ethnic state must be divided into three political parts. First, non-Polish ethnographic districts. Second, ethnographic districts where national minority consists of more than 25%. Third, Polish ethnographic districts where national minority consists less of 25%. Based on the idea of national autonomy, he proposed dividing Poland into independent administrative entities. However, the second element of this structure was to have something like national cultural autonomy and protect the right of national minority. In this case, Sterczewski just used the minority factor to justify the new administrative system and prompt Poland's idea of a national state. In his opinion, the solution of the Jewish question could be found on a base of extraterritoriality. He recognizes that Jews have not populated in distinct territory and therefore should have all civil rights like other national groups. Estimated this vision, Jablonski was correct to conclude that it was a mixture of cultural and territorial elements, whereas the non-territorial one was applied only in the Jewish case. Sterczewski project exemplifies that the territorial dimension in the national minority issue played a more important role. The extraterritorial principle was perceived as a secondary and additional one because it may interfere with national and territorial integrity in some circumstances. He explains this point as follows: for the time being, many Poles were limited to claiming autonomy, dreaming that under this name we would gradually gain independence. This aspect was more evidently highlighted in the essay by the leader of the Polish National Labor Fraction in Moscow, Franciszek Pułaski. He criticized Sterczewski's vision of the place of Poles in political and social economic life in Ukraine. Pułaski addresses ideological and conservative slogans like Polish civilizational mission and Kulturträger role in the East. He writes that in the issue of national autonomy in Ukrainian rights, we should not estimate Poles by amount, but by the quality. Questioning this thesis about the Polish role in Ukrainian history, Polish linguist and Slavist Henryk Ułaszyn responds to Pułaski's speculation. He points to Pułaski's misunderstanding and simplification of the issue of national autonomy. In his opinions, Poles should have a guarantee for autonomy without any justification based on amount or quality of people and contribution to the Ukrainian history. Ułaszyn, like many other Polish politicians, used the term Rus for defending Ukraine and regarded the Polish autonomy in Rus. Interpreting the term autonomy, he concluded that it includes a spectrum of cultural and educational opportunities which stimulate all national development. At this point, Ułaszyn condemns Pułaski's reference to Polish indigenousness in Rus, or something like usurpation of the parish to the merit of the ancestors that only complicates the relations with Ukrainians and other national groups. Very initiative to create national autonomy came from the Polish Democratic Center, which requested this endeavor to the Ukrainian Central Council. The administrative making processes had a vertical dimension in the Polish case, not a horizontal one like it was in the case of Jewish community. The Kievan newspapers broadly described this fact, one of which wrote unambiguously, the position of the Ministry of Polish Affairs differs from the position of other national minorities in that Polish society is divided into three camps that are at the war with each other, all sorts of political democratic groups, a group of conservatives, and the People's Democratic Party. For this reason, the Ministry of Polish Affairs relied on its work on the democratic circles of Polish community. So exactly so-called Polish Democrats were a motive force in this process on the one hand, but ministry had to overcome the above-mentioned obstacles from within on the other. The making of the Polish Secretariat and then the Polish Ministry of Polish Affairs remained just a matter of the Polish Democratic Center. For the National Democrats and Socialists, it was a matter of personal choice. The leading person in shaping the Polish national autonomy, such as Minister Mieczysław Mickiewicz or head of the Department of Education Stanisław Kalinowski, were political opposition to right-wing Polish executive community in Rus. Kalinowski pointed out that the main problem between the lefts and rights was a different ideological understanding of the development of the development of the Polish community. In short, the first one fought for civil rights, the second one for national rights. This tension was manifested by the Polish executive committee in Rus, which perceived itself as a central representation of Poles. Moreover, from July 1917, the committee proclaimed the existence of some kind of domestic autonomy. In many respects, the confrontation influenced the activity of Polish ministry. For instance, many Polish language schools were under the Polish Executive Committee influence and refused to cooperate with the ministry. Despite these troubles, Roman Knoll testifies that the democratic circles were very sympathetic to the Ukrainian movement, which was gaining momentum at the time, that Ukrainophilism was determined primarily by anti-Russian sentiments. The idea of breakup of the Russian Empire was a guiding thought. He argues that the idea of national autonomy could decrease the ethnic contradictions. Knoll was convinced that the deconstruction of the imperial legacy of Russia could only happen in one way: the democratization of power and making of new national state in East Central Europe. At the end of 1917, Ukraine, as Knoll assumed, embraced the slogan of defensive rampart against Moscovites. It is known that this idea was transferred from the Polish ideological discard and the anti-Murala myth. But it's important and it is interesting that after the beginning of Ukrainian Bolshevik War in December 1917, the ministry promoted such type of ideas in Ukrainian ideological discourse. In January-March 1918, the Ministry of Polish Affairs did not manage to arrange the National Council due to the reluctance of the right-wing political stance of Polish community. The National Register Cadastre was working out and had not finished, as well as the project of local self-government for Poles. It also should be stressed that the last one contradicted the principle of national personal autonomy. If during the Ukrainian Central Council, Poles had a privileged position in authority, the situation cardinally changed after the Hetmanate Corps at the end of April 1918. This change in political power also caused a vast flow of Polish refugees from Ukraine to the western borders. One of the leaders of the Polish Democratic Center, lawyer Leon Trzeciak, recalled that in the summer of 1917-18, Ukrainian authority behaved very arrogantly toward Polish activists in Kyiv. At the end of June 1918, the delegation of the Polish Executive Committee visited Hetmanat Prime Minister with inquiry about the government attitude towards the law of national personal autonomy. Prime Minister categorically stated that the law would not be implemented, but government equally treats the cultural aspiration of all nationalities living in Ukraine. As a result, in mid-July 1918, Hetmanate government abolished the national autonomy system. In his testimony, Trzeciak explained that the core goal of making Polish national autonomy was to shape the Polish military forces in Ukrainian lands, especially in Kyiv. This admission is interesting for three reasons. First, this intention was voiced by the acting Minister of Polish Affairs after Hetmanate Corps. Second, it shows that Poles in Kyiv did not consider the idea of national autonomy seriously or just as a tool for achieving political purposes. Third, it illustrates different political stances in the Polish movement concerning the Ukrainian state. Moreover, in the Blonsky archive, are stored many documents that show that process of forming the Polish legions in Ukraine went simultaneously with the forming of autonomy. This fact proves the disarmament of the Second and Third Polish Corps and their local fights with German and Austrian troops in the mid of May 1918. In many cases, the extinction of Polish autonomy could be grasped in this realpolitik context, rooted in the anti-Russian campaign during the First World War. In my opinion, it was not only a consequence of the Hetmanate coup in April 1918. Polish officials of the ministry did not have all necessary competences and powers. After the resignation from ministry office, Chechak also recalled that he had an impression that the Ukrainians made this whole autonomy under coercion and pressure. Future frankly points out that existence of the Polish ministry had only political significance in order to restrain the anti-Polish intentions of the Ukrainian government, shaping pro-Polish policy of the central bodies, and also to obtain money and funds for Polish organizations. Trzeciak regards the function of the Polish national autonomy as a kind of transition period when Poles should not be attached to Ukrainian state. In general, he was convinced that it was an unsuccessful attempt to reconcile Ukrainians and Poles. Other information at that time, in many respects diametrically opposed, delivered by Kievan lawyer Valery Sibnis-Rudnitsky, who served as the Vice Minister of Polish Affairs, assessing the importance of national autonomy. Rudnitsky noted that its introduction was based on Galician animosity in Polish-Ukrainian relations. National democrats spread this hostility and mistrust. In this respect, autonomy was not an actual and sincere undertaking of the Poles, but rather an attempt to prove their historical legitimacy in Ukraine. Poles regarded autonomy as a cultural self-government on the distinct territory, so-called internal autonomy. However, the point of personality, extraterritoriality, was important for influencing domestic Ukrainian politics. Regarding the Ministry of Polish Affairs, Rudnitsky recalled disagreements among Poles. Existed two main groups of influence in the ministry, were led by Leon Trzeciak and Valery Rudnitsky accordingly. The minister Mickiewicz played no prominent role at all. Rudnitsky also saw the reason of this tension in a mixture of ideological concepts that each political party tried to implement in ministry general policy. In his view, the Polish national movement, Polish national autonomy was formed by Polish Democratic Center and socialists, whereas individuals invented the ministry structure. This individual aspect clearly shows that the idea of implementation of national non-territorial autonomy became possible when the condition for such realization appeared. It is also worth to mention that in autumn 1917, the Polish ministry elaborated the project of national cultural autonomy. However, as Rudnitsky started, the Polish clauses and suggestions were not taken into account in the Act of Local Self-Government, but then included in additional policy-making executive act. Future, as he captured, the project was rejected by the chauvinistic groups of the Ukrainian Central Council. This fact is significant for a few reasons. First, Poles had their own understanding on the issue of what autonomy should look like. Second, they proposed some time of cultural autonomy in the territorial dimension. For instance, Rudnitsky constantly defends the rights of Polish landlords in Ukrainian Republic and during the meeting of the Ukrainian Central Council, which fully contradict his leftist views. After the signing of the Brest Treaty, he resigned from the Ukrainian Central Council as the Ministry of Polish Affairs. To conclude, Polish national autonomy was never created, only remained a blueprint structure. The concept of autonomy was only a reflection of political intentions of the Ukrainian authorities. In many ways, it was a very strange story when majority of Ukrainian Poles did not understand and did not aim autonomy in Ukraine. However, some political circles merely used the historical momentum to advise their party interest or tasks for creating military formation in Ukraine. As a result, the Polish autonomy functioned as a department of education, as it was assumed by Zenon Petkevich, and just only raised money for Polish schools and cultural societies. Polish officials used the status of autonomy to legalize the creation of Polish military formation in Ukraine. And in some, the Polish politicians who called themselves Democrats used the concept of national personal autonomy and recognized the Ukrainian state as a political reality. It was during just the short period when Poles were involved in the creation of national autonomy in 1917-1920. Other Polish political camps had not considered Ukraine as an actual political entity and tried to question its legitimacy. Therefore, Polish democratic activists revised their ideological slogans and ethnographic arguments and political debates. And here is, in my final points, will be not point, but questions. Polish autonomy was some kind of transition period or an experiment, as it was assumed by Henryk Jablonski, or just a cabaret, as it was jokingly assumed by Valery Rudnitsky. Thank you so much for your attention.